What happens when the world's most efficient city tries to recycle your old, smelly sneakers, only to accidentally spawn an international smuggling ring that stretches across the Indonesian archipelago? This is Critical Path, where we explore stories and innovations about our global supply chain that connect our world to your everyday life. If you have ever visited the city-state of Singapore, you know that it is a place characterized by meticulous order. It is a gleaming skyline of architectural marvels, a hyper-organized metropolis with an almost fanatical devotion to efficiency. The streets are pristine, the public transport runs with a precision that makes other countries weep, and there is a general sense that every single variable of urban life has been calculated, optimized, and seamlessly integrated. But beneath the shiny surface of this futuristic utopia lies a rather dirty, impossible problem that keeps city planners staring at the ceiling at night. It is the ticking time bomb known as the Semakau Landfill. You see, Singapore is an island. Space is its most precious and limited commodity. When you throw something away in Singapore, there is no vast, empty desert to hide it in. Currently, the nation relies on the Semakau Landfill as its only dumping ground for incinerated ash and non-recyclable waste. And here is the terrifying part. This landfill is projected to reach full capacity by the year 2035. That is not some distant, sci-fi future. That is right around the corner. In this high-stakes, pressure cooker environment, every discarded coffee cup, every broken umbrella, and every blown-out pair of running shoes is a potential liability. It is a battle for the very soul of the city's sustainability narrative. Enter the corporate saviors. In the year 2021, a petrochemical titan named Dow Incorporated decided to partner with the government statutory board, Sport Singapore, to launch a pioneering project. The pitch was an absolute masterclass in public relations. They announced that they were going to transform old, donated sneakers into bouncy playground surfaces and state-of-the-art jogging tracks. The campaign slogan was, frankly, brilliant. It read, "Others see an old shoe, we see the future." The public absolutely loved it. They donated in droves. People were tossing their beat-up kicks into specially branded bins with a sense of righteous ecological pride. It was the perfect closed-loop fantasy. It promised a magical alchemy where your sweaty, degraded footwear would be ground up and reborn as a community asset where children could play. It seemed to solve the problem of footwear waste once and for all. And let us be clear, the problem of footwear waste is staggering. Globally, we produce around 24 billion pairs of shoes annually. Yes, that is 24 billion, with a B. For Dow Incorporated, a company that historically produces the plastics used in fast fashion and packaging, and has faced massive scrutiny for it, this Singapore shoe project was a much-needed victory lap in the arena of environmental responsibility. They were essentially saying, hey, look at us, we are the good guys. We are building the circular economy. The mechanics of this recycling program involved a complex, seemingly foolproof web of corporate partners. Every organization had a specific role in the grand transformation of sneaker to running track. Sport Singapore managed the collection points at its various sports centers. Dow Incorporated managed the materials integration and promoted the brand's sustainable polymers. A German waste management firm named Alba was tasked with the actual logistical coordination and collection of the bins. Then, a company called BT Sports operated the facility that would eventually grind the shoes into rubber granules. Even Decathlon, the massive sporting goods retailer, got in on the action by providing collection points in their stores. It sounded like the Avengers of recycling. The logic was robust, the funding was secure, and the optics were absolutely flawless. In fact, by October of 2022, these partners were standing on a stage accepting an award for the most sustainable collaboration. It was a prestigious accolade that validated their noble efforts. But there was a catch. A massive, glaring, hilariously tragic catch. The real problem was not the technology of grinding up the rubber. The real problem was the black box of the global supply chain. You see, when you drop a pair of shoes into a donation bin, it enters a kind of logistical purgatory. Oversight gets incredibly thin, and the temptation for profit gets incredibly high. To the average citizen, the journey from the collection bin to the playground is an act of pure, unadulterated faith. But to a group of investigative journalists from Reuters, it was a hypothesis that desperately needed testing. These journalists looked at this award-winning, perfectly marketed circular economy project and thought, is this actually happening, or is this just really good corporate storytelling? They decided to solve the mystery of the disappearing sneakers by turning the shoes themselves into high-tech, deep-cover informants. To dismantle this mystery, the investigative team needed a tracking solution that was as discreet as it was durable. This is where things get brilliantly nerdy. You cannot just use a traditional GPS tracker for something like this. GPS trackers have a voracious appetite for power, meaning their batteries die quickly, and they require a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the sky to connect with satellites. That is incredibly difficult to achieve when a shoe is buried at the bottom of a steel shipping container, or suffocating under a 40-foot pile of second-hand clothes. The solution? The Apple Find My network. It is a crowdsourced intelligence system that essentially turns every passing smartphone into a silent, unwitting relay station for the trackers. The choice was a stroke of technical genius because it allowed the team to track the shoes across international borders without needing a cellular connection, a SIM card, or an expensive monthly subscription. Let us briefly geek out on the physics of how this actually works. The trackers use Bluetooth low-energy technology to broadcast an encrypted signal. This signal does not contain any personal data. Instead, it uses rotating public keys to ensure the tracker cannot be stalked by unauthorized parties, which is a hilarious irony, considering the journalists were essentially stalking the shoes. The device periodically emits a silent beacon that basically whispers, "I am here," to any compatible device within a range of about 30 to 100 feet. When a nearby smartphone hears this beacon, it automatically and anonymously records the tracker's identification code and its own current GPS coordinates, and securely uploads that location data to the cloud. Because of end-to-end encryption, only the journalists who own the trackers could decrypt the data and see the location on a map. And because this technology completely bypasses power-hungry cellular radios, the trackers can operate for months on a single, tiny coin cell battery. Armed with this technology, the journalists played doctor. They selected exactly 11 pairs of shoes and performed surgical incisions on them. They cut precise, hidden cavities deep into the rubber midsoles, tucked the little trackers inside, synced them to a smartphone application with clinical labels like Shoe 1, and sealed them back up with heavy-duty, industrial adhesive. Between July and September of 2022, these bug sneakers were casually dropped into official donation barrels across the island of Singapore. They went into the bustling halls of decathlon stores and community-centric sports centers. The investigators were not just looking for a single, anecdotal failure, they were looking for a systemic pattern. If the shoes reached the grinding facility in Jurong, the mission would successfully confirm the program's integrity. If they did not, well, the trackers would provide a digital breadcrumb trail leading directly to the truth. The data that began streaming back to the investigators' phones was not just surprising. It was a complete, logistical map of absolute, unmitigated systemic failure. Out of the 11 pairs of shoes donated, do you want to guess the success rate of this highly publicized recycling program? It was exactly 0%. A staggering, undeniable 0%. Not a single pair of those bugged shoes ever congregated at the grinding facility. Instead, they began a slow, highly synchronized dance toward the southern coast of Singapore. They all converged on one specific warehouse before vanishing entirely across the sea. The diaspora of the sneakers had begun. Let us trace the journey of a pair we will call the Blue Nikes. This pair became the lead narrative of the entire sting operation. Within weeks of being dropped into a supposedly secure recycling bin, the Blue Nikes popped up on the radar at a warehouse in Singapore. From there, they moved across the Singapore Strait to Batam Island in neighboring Indonesia, covering a distance of roughly 20 kilometers by ferry. But the Blue Nikes were just the beginning. Other shoes took far more circuitous and absurd routes. A pair of New Balance sneakers embarked on an epic, 1,200-kilometer odyssey. They hopped from Singapore to Batam, then bounced over to Bintan, then traveled 400 miles north to Medan, before finally turning south again to reach their ultimate destination in the Indonesian capital of Jakarta. It was a grand tour of the archipelago, entirely funded by the premise of corporate sustainability. In total, out of the 11 pairs, several ended up in deeply remote locations across Indonesia, while others had their signals mysteriously lost the moment they touched Indonesian soil. Then there was the case of the white Reeboks, which provided the investigation with a rare moment of localized, domestic comedy. Instead of joining their peers on an international smuggling tour, the white Reeboks were tracked to a public housing estate just 1.6 kilometers away from the very donation bin they were dropped into. This suggested that while the corporate titans were busy failing on a massive, systemic level, local opportunists were engaging in grassroots recycling by simply walking by the bins, reaching in, and fishing out the best pairs for their own personal use. But back to the main operation. To actually find the shoes that went overseas, the journalists had to pack their bags and follow the digital signals directly into the heart of Indonesia's booming, chaotic, and technically illegal second-hand trade. Now we need to talk about Indonesia's relationship with waste, because it is incredibly complicated. Indonesia is a massive consumer of international goods, but officially, the country implemented a strict ban on the import of used clothing and footwear back in 2015. The reasons for this ban were twofold. First, there were serious hygiene concerns regarding the importation of literal waste materials from foreign countries. Second, and more importantly, they needed to protect their domestic textile and footwear manufacturing industries. Local manufacturers simply cannot compete with a massive, endless flood of nearly free, high-quality donations pouring in from wealthier neighboring nations like Singapore. The journalists took a ferry to Batam and headed straight for the sprawling market known as Pasar Second Aviari. This market serves as one of the primary entry points for what locals call ex-Singapore goods. The atmosphere was described as a chaotic symphony. Imagine a labyrinth of vibrant colors, blaring traditional music, and the heavy, pervasive aroma of tropical fruits mixing with the smoke of grilled satay. In this dizzying maze of stalls, the investigators held up their phones, using the Bluetooth signals to play the highest stakes game of hot and cold ever recorded. They zeroed in on a cluttered shop. And there, buried at the absolute bottom of a mountain of used footwear, they found them. The blue Nikes. The vendor working the stall was completely oblivious to the fact that he was currently holding a key piece of evidence in an international journalistic sting operation. He looked at the journalists, smiled, and offered to sell them the shoes for 180,000 rupiah, which equates to roughly 16 Singapore dollars. Think about the thick, suffocating irony of that moment. A shoe that was donated for free by a citizen who thought they were saving the planet, processed by a corporate conglomerate touting its green credentials, was now being sold for pure profit in a country that had explicitly passed a law forbidding its entry. And we cannot gloss over the real, tangible impact of this illegal trade. The influx of these recycled shoes into Indonesia is far from a victimless crime. Indonesian officials, including the Ministry of Industry, have repeatedly pointed out that the illegal import of second-hand goods is carried out in a highly organized manner that specifically and systematically misuses foreign social projects. It causes severe economic destruction. How can an Indonesian factory worker make a living producing new shoes when a perfectly good, name-brand sneaker from Singapore is being hawked in a flea market for under $20? Furthermore, it creates an environmental nightmare. Not every shoe smuggled into Indonesia finds a buyer. The ones that are too worn out of style, or broken, are often just dumped into local rivers or tossed into open fires. So Singapore's celebrated circular economy project was literally being converted into Indonesia's toxic environmental burden. And let us not forget the public health aspect. The lack of sanitization in this underground trade poses genuine risks of skin diseases and hygiene-related issues for the unsuspecting buyers roaming the night markets. But how did this happen? How did a project backed by the government and a multi-billion-dollar chemical company devolve into a smuggling ring? As the journalists peeled back the layers of the supply chain, the massive aha moment finally emerged. It was a revelation so counterintuitive, so obviously flawed, that it exposed the entire greenwashing enterprise as a structural farce. When the investigators tracked the initial data points to that warehouse back in Singapore, they found something they never, ever expected to see. Sitting in the backyard of the facility were the official, brightly coloured Dow and Sport Singapore recycling bins. The warehouse belonged to a company named Yok Impex. Who is Yok Impex? Well, they were the subcontractor hired by the German logistics firm Alba to collect the bins and sort the shoes. But Yok Impex was not a recycling company. Their entire, stated business model was acting as a textile exporter and a second-hand goods trader. Let that sink in. The project hired a professional exporter of used goods to manage a recycling program. The corporate partners later referred to what was happening as parallel sorting, which is an incredibly generous and clinical way to describe what was actually a game of high-stakes financial triage. The workers at Yok Impex were essentially standing over massive piles of donated sneakers, playing judge, jury, and executioner. The mechanism of the failure was terrifyingly simple economics. If a worker picked up a shoe, and it looked like it could be sold in an Indonesian flea market for $15 or $16, it went straight into the export pile to boost Yok Impex's bottom line. Only the shoes that were absolutely destroyed, moldy, completely unwearable, or missing soles were sent to the grinder to be turned into playground granules for a fraction of a cent per pound. The much-lauded circular economy was not being managed by a recycler. It was being ruthlessly curated by a merchant. The logic was the exact equivalent of hiring a very hungry, very enterprising fox to guard your recycling coop, and then standing in front of the press to express your sincere apologies when the chickens mysteriously end up deep-fried and served on a platter in Jakarta. This was not merely a lapse or a tiny vulnerability in the supply chain. It was a fundamental, baked-in conflict of interest that guaranteed the highest quality materials would always be diverted away from their intended environmental goal. When Reuters presented this undeniable, GPS-backed tracking data to the corporate overlords, the response was a breathtaking display of corporate gymnastics. In Singapore, there is a local slang term for the fine art of shifting responsibility and deflecting blame. It is called playing Tai Chi. And boy did these organizations put on a martial arts masterclass. First, Sport Singapore referred all initial media queries directly to Dow. Dow, in a move straight out of the corporate crisis management playbook, announced they were opening an internal investigation. Miraculously, their internal investigation conveniently concluded, just exactly as the Reuters report was being published to the world. The partners issued statements admitting to vague vulnerabilities in the process chain. They took swift, decisive action by promptly firing Yok Impex, throwing the subcontractor squarely under the bus for extracting the shoes for resale. They promised remedial actions. They promised process tightening. They declared they would ban all traders from the logistical chain, require direct transport that bypassed intermediary facilities, and conduct regular spot checks. But the sheer absurdity of the situation reached its absolute zenith in the pristine boardrooms of the Singapore International Chamber of Commerce. You will remember that this project had won the prestigious Most Sustainable Collaboration Award. You would think that after an international exposé revealed the project was acting as an involuntary export business for smugglers, the Chamber might politely ask for the trophy back. Nope. The Chamber of Commerce flat out refused to rescind the award. The chief executive officer of the Chamber publicly stated that there was no basis to review the accolade. His justification? He claimed that because some shoes had indeed been recycled, they estimated about 10,000 kilograms worth of garbage footwear made it to the grinder. The core purpose of the project remained valid. This response highlights a deeply disturbing trend in the modern green corporate landscape. It suggests that as long as the initial intention is noble, the press releases are glossy, and the marketing video has a nice acoustic guitar soundtrack, the actual real-world results are treated as an optional extra. It is the ultimate participation trophy for corporate sustainability. Now, stepping away from the scandalous details of the sneaker shuffle, we need to talk about the theoretical limits of the circular economy itself. The underlying truth is that the footwear industry is structurally resistant to being sustainable. Scholarly research proves time and time again that modern shoes are an absolute nightmare to recycle. Look down at your feet right now. Your shoe is not made of one nice, easily meltable material. It is a highly complex composite. It has EVA foam for cushioning, it has a polyester mesh upper, it has leather or synthetic overlays, it has vulcanized rubber on the bottom, and holding all of these disparate materials together are layers of intense, industrial chemical adhesives. Trying to disassemble a shoe is a labor-intensive, energy-heavy logistical nightmare. In technical terms, grinding a shoe into a playground surface is not true recycling, it is downcycling. You are taking a highly engineered, high-value product and destroying it to create a much lower-value bulk material. Even if every single donated shoe in Singapore had actually reached the grinding facility in Jurong, the sheer amount of electricity required to pulverize them, combined with the toxic chemical additives needed to bind those shredded granules into a cohesive running track, creates its own massive environmental footprint. This leads to a fascinating debate among academic critics. Many argue that simple reuse, literally just giving the shoes to people who want or need to wear them, is actually vastly more environmentally beneficial than grinding them into dust. So, in an incredibly twisted, backwards way, the illegal smuggling and resale of those sneakers by Yok Impex might have actually been better for the global carbon footprint than Dow's official recycling program. That is, of course, assuming those shoes were purchased and worn for years, rather than rotting in an Indonesian landfill 3 months later because they went unsold at the market. So what is the final tally here? The Singapore sneaker shuffle stands as a monumentally important cautionary tale for our current era of green corporate claims. It all started with a genuine, existential problem, a hyper-efficient city-state rapidly running out of physical space, and a public desperate to participate in a solution to the waste crisis. The magic donation bin offered a narrative that was simply too good, too clean, and too easy to be true. And thanks to a handful of journalists and some clever consumer technology, it was proven to be exactly that. Through the silent pings of the Find My network, we were able to pierce the thick veil of corporate opacity. We got to see a system that was quite literally being cannibalized by the very people who were hired to facilitate it. The core lesson here is that in any circular economy project, the sorting phase is the point of maximum vulnerability. It is the weak link in the chain. When the commercial value of a discarded item on the black market exceeds its value as a recycled raw material, the system will naturally, inevitably leak toward profit unless there is ironclad, transparent oversight. The story takes us from the bustling, sweaty energy of the Pasar Ikan flea markets to the quiet, embarrassed apologies in the Singaporean parliament. The corporate partners have promised they will do better. The Indonesian government has vowed, yet again, to tighten its ports against illegal imports. And the general public has been given a free, highly entertaining crash course in the realities of greenwashing. But perhaps the most enduring poetic image of this entire saga is not the cross-country odyssey of the New Balance sneakers, or the blue Nikes sitting on a tarp in Batam. It is the image of those white Reeboks, the ones sitting quietly in a public housing flat just 1.6 kilometers from the exact spot where they were donated. They are a small, silent reminder that even the most high-tech, heavily funded, internationally coordinated corporate shuffle can be effortlessly tripped up by the simplest of human impulses, seeing a nice pair of shoes in a bin and deciding you want to keep them. The future of the circular economy will not depend on the beauty of our advertising taglines or the prestige of our corporate awards. It will depend entirely on the integrity of our collection bins, the transparency of our supply chains, and the persistence of the little tracking devices we hide inside our souls. So, here is a question for all of you watching and listening at home. Do you think that greenwashing is just an inevitable, unavoidable byproduct of the massive scale of modern global supply chains? Or is there a genuine, practical way to hold massive conglomerates accountable when their recycling programs end up looking more like an international smuggling operation? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thanks for listening and watching. Please like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos about the global supply chain.